This is Desm 101. Thanks for tuning in. Today, let's take a look at Universal Soldier on the Sega Genesis. I assume most people watching are familiar with the Turrican series, a masterwork of the European computer game scene by legendary programmer Manfred Trenz and featuring the iconic music of Chris Hulsbeck. The series began on the Commodore 64 and later became a staple on the Amiga. While the Turrican games were a massive hit in the UK and Europe, I never heard about it much aside from seeing an odd review in magazines here and there, or the SNES game on shelves at rental stores. This is due to the fact that I never knew what an Amiga or Commodore 64 was growing up. None of my friends had one, and my family never owned a computer until the mid to late 90s. The way the Turrican series was released on home consoles here in the States is a bit of a confusing and convoluted mess. So we start off with Accolade and their Ballistic label on the Sega Genesis, an unlicensed label. And Accolade acquired the rights to release the Genesis port of Turrican on the Ballistic label. It was handled by Code Monkeys, and this was in 1990. The results were not great. The game has the look and feel of Turrican, but a couple factors like the unforgiving life bar and insane difficulty make this one hard to recommend for fans of the series. There was also a port for the NES, only released in PAL territories, that was made exclusively by Trenz all himself. This port is not a bad version, but obviously it can't be on the level of the Amiga version, but it's still worth checking out. Now fast forward to 1992, Factor 5's phenomenal Turrican 2 looking for release on home consoles, and Code Monkeys working on this port with some much needed improvements. However, it seems Accolade saw the poor sales of the first game, and thinking it could be easier to sell more if they base it on a licensed movie property, acquired the rights to Universal Soldier, the new movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren. This was likely in the final months of development, and before the game was released we see that there was a few changes made in a couple levels which referenced the movie and replaced the shooter stages from the Amiga version. This left many upset and scratching their heads as to how they could not even give credit to the original team who made the game. They replaced bosses with giant Dolph Lundgren sprites, along with some generic vehicle bosses, and swapped out many of the enemies for generic Universal Soldier themed sprites, the most hilarious being the guy in the tank. Thus, we ended up with Universal Soldier, only released on Genesis Mega Drive. Although there was a SNES port in the works, it never saw the light of day. While the game certainly loses points for changing the source material and stamping over it with the generic cash grab movie license, the game still fares better than its first Turrican port to home consoles. It has almost nothing to do with the movie, which works well in this case when you look at other movie-based games around this time like Lawnmower Man and Time Cop for just a couple examples. This is the closest we would get to seeing Turrican 2 on home console, and indeed most people who play this game immediately note the undeniable similarity to the Turrican games. So let's take a look at the game. This time we can select from two difficulty settings, with the default being much easier than the first Turrican game on the Genesis. We also have passwords for each level, but if you play on either difficulty setting you still get the same password. Oops, I guess they missed that detail. The controls are more in line with the standard Turrican games. You can now jump on smaller enemies to cause damage, something that was missing in the first game on the Genesis. And the roll maneuver is not limited this time, thank goodness, and is used by pressing down and jump simultaneously. Holding the A button gives your lightning whip, which can be rotated around 360 degrees around your character. This is great for quickly finding and extracting items from hidden power-up blocks, protecting yourself from nearby enemies that require a ton of hits. The B button jumps, but like the Amiga game you can also jump by pressing up on the D-pad, a control I'm not fond of, and still have issues getting used to on the Amiga games. The C button fires your classic line attack, and if you press all three ABC buttons at once, you can release another smart bomb type attack that damages everything on screen. I didn't really use this as much as the line attack, so I find that one to be sufficient in most cases. The levels retain their layout from the Amiga games aside from new levels and some changes to the order of stages. This means tons of exploring with hidden power-ups and one-ups, massive levels that you can feel lost in at times where you're trying to figure your way out. It was clear that Trends was inspired by the likes of Metroid and Contra, and the game really shines in its own interpretations on these classic gaming powerhouses. The enemies are varied and plentiful. The later levels, their placement can seem diabolical at times, making your stockpile of lives from the earlier stages drain very quickly. The bosses could have been much better, however, and the lack of difficulty and good design in the boss fights is definitely a sore spot in the game. Ultimately, it's kind of hard to love this game. The credit really goes to the original creation Manfred Trends for the elements that draw you into the game. If Code Monkeys and Accolade would have went the extra mile to put in content that was able to stand up against the original levels and bosses, as well as give credit to the original team, this could be really something of a unique interest. But it kind of deserves being labeled as the black sheep of the Turrican series. Still, if you don't mind a bargain bin bastardized version of Turrican, this is some good fun to be had, in kind of a guilty pleasure type of way. Now, it was followed up by the Data East release and Factor 5 developed Mega Turrican, a beautiful and challenging game in its own right, but one that still finds some of the classic Turrican feeling lacking, due to the somewhat oversimplified linear levels. To me, that's really one of the best parts of Turrican game, the massive levels that the player can explore. But still, you may prefer the third game in the series because it's easily the most polished, and it was handled directly by Factor 5 instead of Code Monkeys. Any way you look at it, the Turrican series deserves to stand out as how to properly create an homage to the archetypes of run and gun and expansive exploration in 2D gaming. And that's going to wrap it up today, guys. Thanks so much, and have a good one.